Yeah, so what I want to speak about today is the intersection of what I call the manufactured housing gap. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the climate gap, which many of you are probably more familiar with. And part of the reason I decided to sort of frame this talk this way is because there was a really excellent piece of reporting that was done by ProPublica recently that I had Stuart circulate to all of you. Hopefully my slides will advance here. That was looking at the climate gap. You know, this is the disproportionate and unequal impact of the climate crisis on people of color and the poor in the Coachella Valley. And, you know, this was a particularly dramatic illustration of the sort of differing fortunes between this, elite gated community devoted to auto racing with the conditions being lived in by oftentimes undocumented farm workers in oftentimes poorly maintained and manufactured homes in the same city. So it was a particular, I don't know if I hope you've all had a chance to read through the article because I think it's quite good on a number of levels. See, there's a question in the chat. I can't see what it is, but
Jessica's just commenting that she said the paper was eye-opening and very difficult to read. I assume that means difficult as in a hard experience, not hard to comprehend.
Now, as good as I thought the piece was, and as dramatic a contrast as they were able to paint between this, you know, this resort of thermal and you know, the mobile home parks lived in by many agricultural laborers, I want to suggest that a very similar sort of juxtaposition can be found across the United States, and indeed in Tucson as well. And the conditions that were displayed, you know, in the resorts we have in Tucson, we have very elite resort spaces as well. And I can tell you from the work that I've done, working in some of the more challenged mobile home parks, the conditions that we have, these conditions in Tucson as well. So this gap exists here as well. It exists everywhere across the United States. And I wanted to, one of the things that they didn't really talk, they did talk about a fair amount about mobile homes, but I wanted to sort of really focus in on why it is that manufactured housing tends to be a site of climate vulnerability. Okay, so what is this manufactured housing gap, and how does it intersect with this climate gap? By manufactured housing gap, I simply mean that there's nothing inherently insecure or marginal about a home built in a factory. In fact, there's all kinds of reasons why we might expect a home built in a factory to be cheaper to build, but also better insulated, better quality. And yet, the reality is that manufactured housing is often this nexus of a point of connection between various forms of social, financial, health, and environmental vulnerabilities. So what is the reason that this gap exists? Why is it that there is this so much promise around manufactured housing, but that promise is rarely realized? So that's kind of what I've been devoted to over the past 2 or 3 years. And I think it's kind of interesting that manufactured housing occupies this strange position of contrasts in our collective imagination. You know, we oftentimes we think about living in a small portable home as being this gateway to a utopian sort of sustainable lifestyle, right? But we also see manufactured housing as this potential symbol of a dystopian future, as displayed in the recent film based on the book, Ready Player One, where the main character lives in what I think is supposed to be, you know, a future Columbus, Ohio, living in these stacked mobile homes. So this is another sort of articulation of this MH gap, this manufactured housing gap. Before going any further, though, I think it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time just talking about what is manufactured housing, because it's not entirely obvious. So it's a regulatory category. And I think it's worthwhile to sort of walk through this a little bit. So manufactured housing, these are housing units with permanent chassis. So a permanent way in which you can affix wheels to it. They don't have wheels on them necessarily, but they're built in a factory and then installed at a site. The colloquial term for manufactured housing is mobile home or even trailer. The term mobile home still has use. In fact, I think in regulation, anything that was built before 1976 is still called a mobile home. And then in 1976, there was a special code passed at the national level that basically created standards for these factory-built homes. And after that, everything is called a manufactured home. So there's in this talk, I'm going to refer to this blanketly as MH or manufactured housing. And the reason why I prefer the less colloquial term that focuses on post-1976 housing is because the mobility aspect of this phrase is really a misnomer. Most mobile homes or manufactured housing is not actually mobile. It moves once. It moves from the factory to the place where it's sited and then never moved again. And that's because it's prohibitively expensive to move these units. They can be moved, but I will point out that any structure can be moved, right? And it's just a question of whether or not you're willing to pay the expense. And for the most part, it is not the people who living in manufactured housing don't have the resources or don't see the value in moving this housing. Okay, so that's the mobility aspect of this is really a misnomer. I think it's worthwhile because people are always often enthusiastic about tiny homes. Tiny homes are actually regulated as RVs, but they're very similar. Again, like various, these homes fit into these murky regulatory categories. I also just want to point out that within the category of these manufactured housing, the range of quality and appearance can vary quite tremendously. In this image here, I think can you see my cursor over the screen? Yeah. This is a manufactured home, and so is this. Okay. Any questions about this? Does this clarify anything for folks here?
It's just a striking distinction between pre-76 and post-76. And you've answered a lot of questions that I certainly was having. What does it mean to be manufactured? What does it mean to be mobile?
Yeah, I also should just say, and I don't know, maybe I have this on a slide in the future to clarify it further. But one of the things that distinguishes manufactured housing from other types of housing is the governing level at which it is regulated. So when you build a home in Tucson on site, it has to meet a local building code, right? Manufactured housing does not have to meet a local building code. The code that it has to meet is at the national level. Okay, there might be regulations about where the home has to be positioned, how it has to be installed in place, but the actual structure, the code that oversees the actual structure is a national code, not a local code. Which is, in theory, another reason why it can be more affordable. There's supposed to be less red tape associated with building to the standard.
Okay. I have a quick
question.
I have a quick question, Mark. Was there a time period where states regulated the structures?
Yeah.
And it's got unified at some point, probably because that's the way industry wanted it to go, the manufactured housing industry, to avoid state by state regulation?
That's an interesting, that's a good theory. I think that there is an aspect of that, like, they wanted to avoid the sort of patchwork quilt of regulation. And I can tell you that some of the research that I've done in the past on consumer protection regulation has certainly, the industry has driven towards preemption of state and local laws in favor of national laws to create that sort of unified, quote unquote, playing field or market. But I'm not sure how much the industry supported the HUD code, which is what basically created this national standard. It was a hodgepodge of different standards, and oftentimes there were no standards, is my understanding, pre-1976. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the problems with that. But I think it was largely a response to the fact that this was a form of housing that was rapidly expanding across the country and was becoming a problem. This is the problem in terms of its building quality, but it was also perceived as a problem by municipalities who were concerned about various aspects of it, which we can maybe get into in a discussion a little bit later on. I don't want to get too far off my track here. So to get back on track, today's talk, I want to talk about a little bit about the geography of manufactured housing here in Pima County. And when I say Pima County, I basically mean Metro Tucson. All the data I'm presenting is, census data or American Housing Survey data or American Community Survey data. And for the Census Bureau, essentially Pima County and Metro Tucson are the same thing. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of specific geography of this manufactured housing gap. Where is it? What holds it open? That kind of thing. And then intersecting and compounding forms of vulnerability. I know this is a sustainable, sustainability-oriented group, and I think that probably as a result of that, you're well aware of the intersections between, the environment, the economy, and society. But I think we often don't necessarily think about those intersections in the context of vulnerability. We tend to think about, environmental vulnerability as being somewhat distinct from social or economic vulnerability. And I want to sort of show how these are interconnected in particularly pernicious ways in manufactured housing. And to do that, I'm going to be looking at specifically the connections between manufactured housing and extreme heat vulnerability here in the desert Southwest. And I'll also maybe speak a little bit about how those intersect with COVID as well. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the broader national context, I've created this list of the top 20 manufactured housing metropolitan statistical areas in the United States. And basically what I did was I looked at places that were over 500,000 people in population and that had over 5% of the housing, of their total housing in manufactured housing. And then I ranked them according to that. And based on that metric, Tucson is the seventh most prominent metropolitan statistical area in terms of the presence of manufactured housing. So we have a lot of manufactured housing. We have about 54,000 units of manufactured housing in Tucson, which puts it at around 10% of all housing units. And it also corresponds to about 100,000 people live in manufactured homes in Tucson, which is about 10% of the population. It's not evenly distributed. You can see here, this corresponds, so just to clarify here, I don't know if I'll have time to talk about why this distinction matters, but the purple dots correspond to 10 units of manufactured housing that are real property. In other words, they're titled as real estate. The home is legally attached to the land that it sits on, whereas all of the blue dots correspond to manufactured housing that is titled as personal property. In other words, it's owned independently of the land that it sits on. In other words, you can't get a mortgage loan to purchase it, which is really important. And MH in the United States more generally tends to be a highly segregated from other types of housing. And Tucson is really no different here. You can see it tends to be very clustered in particular areas of the city. I can highlight some of these clusters here. So in Flowing Wells, that's here, down between Mission and the I-19, and then between the I-10 and the airport. Those are the three clusters that account for certainly most of the urban MH in Tucson. And in some of these areas, manufactured housing is the only type of housing you find. And there are parts of Flowing Wells outside of the city of Tucson proper. I have good data on it because it's actually a census community, but you have 2 units of manufactured housing for every 5 adults, right? So this is by far and away the most dominant form of housing in parts of the city. Like it basically, like the city of Tucson, parts of the city of Tucson are basically cities composed of manufactured housing. That's where all of the residential, the main form of residential housing is manufactured housing. So I pointed out that there's nothing inherently problematic about manufactured housing. I'm actually a big fan of manufactured housing. I wish we were building more of it. But I do know that it is a site of insecurity and vulnerability for a lot of people. So how do we think about the challenges that we are seeing in manufactured housing without painting this already stigmatized form of housing, that's often referred to as trash housing? I'm sure I don't like to use this term all that much, but trailer trash is a term that probably many of you are familiar with. So how do we talk about the problems with this that exist in this type of housing, the reasons those problems exist, without painting this whole category of housing and the people who call it home with too broad a brush, right? So how do we narrow in on the manufactured housing that we are concerned about, and then to uplift the examples of it that are providing really high quality of life at low cost for people. Okay, so to do this, I want to just do some basics here. What about the relationship between risk, vulnerability, and resilience, and housing insecurity, and how that relates to this concept of the MH gap. So maybe you're all familiar with this, but risk, as I understand it in very simple terms, is the possibility of an event that causes harm. This could be a social or economic risk, or like losing someone's your job, or it could be a stressor in your life. It could be economic. It could be environmental. Rising temperatures could be an example of an environmental stressor. An economic stressor might be inflation, that kind of thing. Vulnerability is how exposed you are to that event, plus your sensitivity to that risk, and then your adaptive capacity in the face of experiencing that, right? So vulnerability is this sort of composite concept that brings together your exposure to risk, your sensitivity to those risks, and then your ability to adapt when you face it. But I also just want to highlight that being vulnerable to something in relation to your housing does not necessarily translate into housing insecurity. When someone, and here there's no widespread fully agreed upon definition of housing insecurity, but the way I like to define housing insecurity is for folks that have a home. So we're not looking at homeless populations. There are definitions or people that study housing insecurity to look specifically at homelessness and unhoused populations. But I'm interested in folks who have a home but face uncertainty about their ability to retain that home or to stay there for any number of different reasons. These could be environmental reasons, these could be financial reasons, these could be reasons related to domestic abuse, any number of reasons, right? So risk is related to vulnerability, which is related to insecurity, but these are not inherent connections, right? Just because you've been exposed doesn't necessarily mean you're vulnerable if you have great adaptive capacity or you're not very sensitive. And just because you are vulnerable in some way doesn't necessarily mean that that translates into housing insecurity. Does this make sense? Okay.
Yes, and Mark, when there's time, we'd love to hear, you commented that you think there should be more manufactured housing. So don't forget, we'd love to hear your reasons for that, but don't want to take you off track.
Sure, that maybe is better left to a Q&A at the end here, and I can move through certain sections a little faster. I don't know how much background people have in this group, but our understanding of what the MH gap is that where it would be the place where we see a lot of different forms of vulnerability overlapping and compounding each other. So this is a sort of conceptual map. We can imagine this being a city like Tucson, the black rectangles representing manufactured housing, and these circles representing different forms of vulnerability. And where we expect this manufactured housing gap to be the largest is in areas where we see these environmental, social, and financial forms of vulnerability intersecting the most. Does that make sense? Right, this MH gap is where these things overlap the most.
Mark, what does it mean if something isn't within any of those?
Well, it would just mean that these are places that are, for whatever reason, less exposed, less sensitive, and have greater adaptive capacity in the face of risks of various kinds. So I just want to go through an example of how these different forms of vulnerability intersect. Okay, so we live in the desert Southwest in a geography of exposure. Climate scientists suggest that we are going to be here in the border region experiencing higher temperatures, more days above 100 degrees, and longer heat waves. So we are going to be more exposed to extreme heat. And we have a very sensitive set of structures. And here I'm specifically going to focus on pre-76 manufactured housing. Okay, so this is before these national standards were passed. These pre-76 homes, which represent 35% of all of the manufactured housing here in Tucson. So that's about 17,000 units of pre-1976 manufactured homes, or I guess they're technically mobile homes, but I'm going to call them manufactured homes in Tucson. These units often have no insulation or very little insulation. Their wiring was often not at a standard that would support an air conditioner that would have the capacity to effectively cool a home, right? And oftentimes they are home to relatively sensitive populations, lower income populations who don't necessarily have as much ability to adapt by moving or spending more money on air conditioning, but also older populations. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the population that living in manufactured housing across the country, but in Tucson as well, tends to be older on average. So you have heat sensitive structures with a highly sensitive population living inside. Now, what is the obvious thing to do when you're exposed to heat? And how do you keep your home cool? You go inside. How do you keep your home cool? Well, you run the AC unit more. And if you're living in a poorly insulated home that can't support a highly efficient HVAC system, that leads to really high energy bills, which are often hard for you to pay. Maybe you can't make all of your payments at the end of the month, which increases your financial vulnerability, risk of eviction, and so on. So we can see the way in which by not that many steps, we can translate growing exposure to extreme heat related to climate change to the financial vulnerabilities and risk of eviction. Is this do we see this chain of events unfolding here? So how do we get from climate vulnerability to housing insecurity. This is one illustration of this. There's probably many pathways that could be taken, but this is one that we're particularly concerned about in manufactured housing. Okay, so how do we identify those populations or those parts of the city where these different forms of vulnerability intersect the most? The standard way to do this is to produce a vulnerability index, essentially, and then you see where different areas of the city rank according to this vulnerability index. So you would look at all kinds of things that you think would be correlated with vulnerability: low income, lower levels of educational attainment, urban heat island, flood zones, any number of things. We could sit around all day and think of different indicators or proxies for vulnerability, and then find a way to map them. We should actually have a paper coming out very soon that's developing a kind of a new approach to mapping what we call manufactured housing vulnerability. But there are lots of ways of mapping social vulnerability, climate vulnerability out there. And what we essentially did was we looked at the relationship between the presence of manufactured housing on the landscape and indicators of vulnerability. So we created this map of Tucson, and the darker areas are the areas that we thought were of greater concern, where we thought there would be more likely to be people that were experiencing vulnerability and housing insecurity in their manufactured homes. Does this make sense? Okay, but you can't conclude that just because someone is living in a manufactured home in a census block group that we have declared as high vulnerability, that they are actually experiencing housing insecurity, or are actually themselves, they actually themselves feel vulnerable. Maybe there are other factors at play, or maybe, correlation between this indicator that we've chosen off the shelf as an indicator of vulnerability and people's lived experience. There's a gap there, right? So to actually understand the relationship between environmental, social, and financial vulnerability in people's lived experiences, what you need to do is actually talk to people. And so that's what we did. We took these maps and we used them not as like the end product, or like we had discovered the MH gap. No, we use that as a heuristic to say, these are the places where we're more likely to find people that have insights to share with us about how various forms of risk exposure in their lives translate or not into lived vulnerability and housing insecurity. So we went out and we spoke to people, and we were looking for people that were living in areas that our index suggested should not be that vulnerable, but where people were experiencing vulnerability and insecurity. So we called these folks sensitive populations. These are communities that are of special concern. What makes them so sensitive? You're in an area which all of the indicators suggest should not be experiencing much vulnerability, but for whatever reason you are. So what is it about your living situation that renders you more vulnerable? There are folks living in low vulnerability areas that are experiencing not very much vulnerability or insecurity. That's expected favorable. There are folks who are living in these high vulnerability, high concern areas that are living that experience. What can we learn from them? And then there's these, what we call resilient communities, folks that are living in manufactured housing in areas that we think should be highly vulnerable, but for whatever reason are not. So these are the different groups and we were using essentially these maps to come up with a sampling strategy for how to talk to people. Okay, so the themes that emerged from these interviews were around housing insecurity, financial insecurity, social vulnerability, aging in place, immobility, and predatory practices, but also in particular environmental vulnerability, which is what I want to focus on today. So who did we talk to? We did approximately 85 interviews as a part of this project. 71 of them were with MH residents. The median household income was about $30K. 40% lived in homes built in 1976 or earlier. You can look at all the details here broken down. A very high level of housing cost burden was being experienced among this population. Housing cost burden, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, it's defined somewhat, usually there's some variation in how it's defined, but it's people that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing related expenses. And then there is also a substantial chunk that are energy cost burdened. Again, there's different ways of defining this, but for us, that was spending more than 5% of their income on energy related expenses. Okay. Okay. So here I'm trying to be a little bit provocative. We think about climate change as something that is happening outside. And what I want to suggest to you is that at least in the United States, climate change will mostly be experienced inside. People in the US spend 90% of their time indoors, and most of that time they spend at home, right? So in other words, when we think about what we're going to do in the face of these high temperatures, we're going to go inside, we're going to spend more time inside. So in other words, in the context of climate change, our indoor environments start to matter a lot more. They're a key part of our strategy for adapting to climate change. But as we spend more time indoors, those indoor spaces become much more important for our understanding of vulnerability to climate change, right? Because we spend so much time indoors, indoor spaces have a huge impact on our health. And we know, but without much research, that home environments are highly unequal. And we focus most of our research in relation to climate change outdoors and what we do outside of our homes, right? We don't know as much about the places that we spend the majority of our time and our lives. Okay, so what the work that we're doing on manufactured housing is really drawing attention to what I've started calling, and there are a number of concepts that are somewhat related to each other, but that I call home or household thermal security, right? Which is the ability of a household to maintain a stable home thermal environment that's consistent with basic health, social, and financial needs, right? In other words, this is the ability of people to control the temperature of their home. And the conceit or the idea here is that by understanding this home thermal security, this ability of people to have home environments that are consistent with their health, social, financial needs, we can learn more than just about temperature, right? Indoor temperature tells us a lot more than just hot and cold. We can learn certainly about exposure to heat. We can learn about the conditions of the home, but we can also learn about economic and financial security. We can learn about social capital, the ability, or people's social connections, their ability to access resources outside of the home through personal networks and so on. We can even learn about the consequences of border enforcement. I know it sounds strange, but we've been this summer we've actually been doing a new research project where half of our participants are undocumented, and what we're finding is that people's willingness or necessity to live in places that they can't keep cool is often dictated by a narrowing of home choices. And there are various factors in people's lives, from poor credit to a criminal record to lack of immigration documents, that can often lead people to choose to live in places they can't keep cool. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can take this very local, intimate space of the home and connect it out to, even sort of geopolitical set of challenges that we face. And this relates to different ways in which people experience extreme heat. So this is building on the work of a researcher up at ASU named Melissa Gordero, but she sort of ranks how people respond in relation to heat exposure between heat as an inconvenience. You can avoid it most of the time, maybe because your job is indoors. You have a home that has an efficient HVAC system, or at least that you can afford to run and pay, $200, $300 bills in the summer. Heat is a manageable problem, and then heat is a catastrophe. People who have little ability to avoid the heat and who are heat sensitive, right? And they have very little adaptive capacity. So this is the population that we think exists in fairly large numbers within this category of housing, manufactured housing. And there are a few reasons for this. So we've already talked about this. Most of us take for granted our ability to beat the heat by simply staying inside. And what we found is that within manufactured housing, there are a lot of people who are very sensitive to heat exposure, but also who cannot take for granted the ability to stay cool by staying inside. So here's some data to really drive this point home. These are figures from our colleagues up at ASU. In particular, we've been working closely with Patricia Solis and David Hondula up there in the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience Institute. But this is a map showing utility assistance recipients in Metro Phoenix, and the red dots are indoor heat-related deaths. Can anyone notice any patterns emerging here? As our colleagues noticed something that was very interesting.
The path along that horizontal line is interesting.
Are you looking at this area here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where you see a lot of heat-related deaths, but very few, or relatively few, utility assistance recipients. And so our colleagues noticed what Trace noticed and zeroed in on that. And what they found was a preponderance of manufactured housing mobile home park communities. And, yeah, I want to get to that in a second. And so what they did was they did this study where they tracked what was going on in terms of different households' ability to control the temperatures of their homes. And what they found was quite a bit of variation. So this is the temperature inside folks' homes, right? So we have groups where the variability in the temperature is actually very little, and we have groups for whom the temperature varies almost consistently with what's going on outside. Right? If it's 110 degrees outside, maybe it's 105 inside the house, versus if it's 110 degrees outside and it's 84 degrees in the house, right? So this is an interesting method by which to really zero in. It's just looking at temperature, but it's really zeroing in on this, on populations that are experiencing this home thermal insecurity. So we're actually engaged in a version of this right now in Tucson. Okay. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the relationship between adaptive capacity and COVID-19. This year is going to be by far and away the record in Arizona for heat caused and heat associated deaths. Now, the data needs to be dug into a little bit better, but it doesn't seem as though there was as much of an increase in indoor heat-related deaths as I would have expected based on the analysis that I'm going to provide right now. But we'll see. We'll see as we dig into that data a little bit more what sort of relationships we see. But here we have various stressors that people experience in their lives. Let's imagine this is a manufactured housing household. Heat is one of those stressors. These are various responses that people can take to adapt to that heat. They can go for a drive, they can find some shade, build shade structures over their homes, they can go to a restaurant, they can insulate their home more, go to the library, go to a cooling center, invest in a better AC unit, stay at a friend's house, turn up the thermostat, go to pool, any number of different things. And at least for a period of time during the pandemic, many of those were cut off. Many of those ways to adapt were cut off. And so around the spring of early in the spring of 2020, when we were doing this research, we thought, gosh, this is something that we need to be really concerned about. We're going to see much more heat-related deaths. And it seems as though that unfortunately has come to pass. In other words, that COVID has sort of shifted most people living in these already thermally vulnerable conditions in older manufactured housing on the continuum from heat as an inconvenience to heat as a catastrophe. Yeah, and I think this is important to note that there's a tremendous amount of variability across the population in terms of capacity to adapt to extreme heat. And the impacts of this mixture of insecure housing, pandemic disease, and extreme heat are being experienced differently according to income, age, race, and housing type. Okay, so why should we expect sensitivity and COVID-19 to be particularly pronounced in manufactured housing? Well, one, they're already overrepresented in heat-related deaths. Our colleagues up at ASU who are able to do this analysis in large part because Maricopa County collects better heat-associated death data and health data than we do down here in Pima County. But their calculations suggest that in the worst years, you're 8 times more likely to die of heat-related causes if you're living in a manufactured home as opposed to other housing types. So this seems to be the housing type which is most overrepresented among populations that die of heat-related causes. So just another illustration of this point. And I think this is actually in this statistic, which they got from me actually, that's in the piece on the Coachella Valley. Is here as well. So 4.9% of housing units are manufactured housing in Maricopa County, but they represent about 27.5% of the indoor heat-associated deaths. Like I said, it's hard to extrapolate this to Pima County, but there are lots of reasons to think that here in Tucson we have similar challenges. Indeed, you know, we have similar temperatures, similar climate. I know we like to talk about how things are so much cooler here in Tucson, but the reality is they're not that much cooler. And our population is poor, and the proportion of housing that is manufactured housing is much higher here than in Phoenix. In Phoenix, it's around 4.9% of all housing units. Here, again, I think I mentioned this already, it's around 10%. So these issues that are very clearly emerging between health impacts of extreme heat in particular housing types should be of equal to greater concern here in Pima County. The people who are the most in need of protection of their homes are the ones most likely to die inside them, right? So this is something we were concerned about, is that one of the ways in which we were supposed to keep ourselves safe from COVID is to stay at home. What about for those people who were staying at home in places they couldn't keep cool, right? This was our concern. 15.7% of Phoenix residents are 65 and older, but they make up 59% of those who die indoors of heat-related causes, and had more than half of all manufactured housing households. And they clearly are overrepresented in coronavirus deaths, although I understand because of vaccination that is starting to improve. And this, just to give you a sense, is the range of ages that we spoke to among the 71 MH residents that we interviewed. The 65 and older set was highly represented. I neglected, Stuart, to share this with you, but I gave a similar talk to a group that maybe some of you are familiar with, Climate Tucson, a little more than a year ago. And it turns out that one of the participants in that group, actually one of the people that organizes it, Karen Peterson, is also a freelance reporter. And she spoke with me for a long time. She spoke with me, engaged with me for a couple of months around some of these issues, and wrote a really great article in the Washington Post that came out about a month ago. And so I thought I could share this with you. Maybe I'll put it into the chat box after, but it covers a lot of ground really efficiently around some of these issues. Among the folks that we spoke to, many don't have a furnace or an AC unit. They engage in dangerous or expensive adaptation strategies when dealing with extreme weather. Even though we think about, we focus on extreme heat in this research, we were surprised to find a lot of people were really struggling, actually had their highest energy bills in the winter months, even here in Tucson, and people doing things like leaving the oven open to keep their homes warm in the winter. 73% of those we spoke to were energy cost burdened. And we can see here that only about 18%, 17.5% actually had an AC unit. We've dug much more deeply into some of this data, and one of the things we've discovered is that this is a financial adaptation strategy. We tend to think about HVAC, air conditioning, and so on as being an adaptation to climate conditions, but the preference for a swamp cooler is almost entirely financial. People worry about having an AC unit because they worry about being able to pay the bills. Relying on a swamp cooler is a way to kind of ensure, or maybe not ensure, but guarantee, but protect against the possibility of that $200 or $300 summertime energy bill.
Mark, the title of this slide is What People Don't Have. It looks like those bar graphs are what they do have. I'm not clear. 70% don't have an evaporative cooler?
Do not have, sorry, that's right. Do not have an air conditioner. Yeah, so but that is as what we've found is that as you go further down in terms of vulnerability, you have more vulnerable populations. The preference for not having an air conditioning unit goes up, and that's some of the logic behind that. Okay, so what needs to be done? This is maybe where we can move into more of a conversation. We need to better understand what the links are between extreme heat and health with better data. We don't have very good data on this. The few jurisdictions that do a fairly good job of collecting this data tell a very concerning story, like what we see in Maricopa County. So I'd like to see some greater standardization of that sort of data collection. One of the things that we need to do is increase funding and eligibility for energy assistance. The largest source of energy assistance funds in the United States is this low-income home energy assistance program, LIHEAP. And oftentimes the most vulnerable people living in manufactured housing are not eligible for this. And that's because there are a couple of reasons for this. typically you're not, if your home is considered mobile, you're not eligible. But the bigger issue, as we've come across it, is that older manufactured housing communities are often master metered. So the individual homeowners are not the customers of the utility. And so they're not able to access the assistance programs that are usually administered through the utilities. They get billed through a sub-metering company. So in other words, the owner of the manufactured housing community will pay the bill to, in our case, TEP, and then a sub-metering company will determine how much each of the individual units in the park owe for electricity and then bill them separately. We need more affordable housing. And I think that, the people's willingness to live in what often amounts to substandard, highly vulnerable housing that people are concerned about their ability to stay in for various reasons is because there are not better alternatives available. And I think the pandemic and the concerns about, evictions and the necessity of eviction moratoria, for instance, represents an acute convergence of a longer term set of social pressures. And there was a period of hopefulness during the pandemic that we would recognize that and use the pandemic as a moment of motivation to make bigger investments. And I think that there is still a possibility of that, but I think that that potential largely remains to be fulfilled. So I'm hopeful, but I think that there's a lot more that we can do. And I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of manufactured housing, and we can talk a little bit more about that as well. One of the things that's become, abundantly clear from the research we did this summer is that the people that we're the least concerned about in terms of heat health effects, people dying in their homes of heat-related causes, are the people that are the best connected. People that are in contact with others on a regular basis. And so I think that we may have many of us probably have people in our lives that we're concerned about when the temperatures get really high. And I think that we oftentimes stop ourselves from making a phone call or getting in touch or paying a visit for these reasons, because we don't want people to feel like we're worried about them or something like that. Or but I think that this is a real issue. This has become very clear I think during the heat waves that we had in June and July, that these heat events, these heat weather events, the impacts are often much more hidden than with a hurricane or a flood or a tornado or a wildfire, but they are no less deadly. And you would never hesitate if there was a big windstorm or a flood in a certain area to go and check on some people who who were potentially affected by that. And I think we should have similarly no hesitation about checking on people who live in vulnerable conditions when we're in the midst of a heat wave. So there's lots more to be done, but I'll just stop there and just highlight again that there are a lot of people that have been involved in this in some way, shape, or form, whether or not they're other professors or professionals, as I've listed here on the left, or graduate students and undergraduate interns. And this is not even a complete list. So, I'm open to questions now. Thanks all of you for having me. And if you want to send me an email, you can do that at mkear@arizona.edu. So I'll stop yammering on at this point, and then I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mark. Let's start with a question from Tori, and then Nancy, and then Danye. From Tori, why again do you think we should have more manufactured housing?
Well, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there are people living in very high quality communities at very low cost. I'm going to go back a few slides here, if I can here.
So what you're saying is that there's a real potential in this this kind of housing?
Okay, yeah. So this photo is for a home that is for sale, that was for sale. It's out, actually, I drove by recently. Someone is living in there now. But this is a place that is substandard, right? If this were owned by a landlord and rented, the landlord would be at risk of being sued for basically providing substandard housing. One of the tricks of the manufactured housing business model is that you as a landlord are not responsible for the conditions that people live in, because you actually sell the home to the person. So you're not responsible for the plumbing, you're not responsible for the toilets and so on. You sell that home for as little as possible, oftentimes, just to make sure that they start paying rent for the land that it sits on. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is that I interviewed a couple, actually a brother and sister, in the same park where this place was. They took ownership of a home that was in a similar condition for free, with an understanding that they would fix it up. They were paying around $500 a month in lot rent. Across the street is a park, one of the nicest parks in the city. It has its own solar array. It has a stocked lake. It has multiple clubhouses with swimming pools, and residents there were paying less per month than the folks in this park across the street. So you're talking about literally the exact same part of the city where someone was paying less for much higher quality housing. So you see these sorts of contrasts all over the city. And the question is, what are the conditions that support this strange market? And you know, I'm working through all of this material, but the point that I want to make here is that it's not the manufactured housing that is the source of the problem. It is the sets of financial, social, political relations in which the housing is embedded that creates the problem. You know, and this is, I think, a broader issue for a group like this to talk about, you know, because in the context of, you know, environmental sustainability, oftentimes there is a desire to associate a better, more sustainable tomorrow with particular technologies. But that's what manufactured housing is. It is a particular technology. And what it illustrates so effectively is that that technology, which there's net zero manufactured housing out there. That technology on its own does not create sustainability. It's the social structures in which it's embedded that determine ultimately whether or not it will produce sustainable outcomes or not. And when we find a better set of conditions, we think that manufactured housing can realize much more of its potential. And the best examples of this that I've been able to find in Tucson are the very rare examples of cooperatives. So there are only 3 of them in Tucson, one very small, 2 substantially sized, but there are 2 manufactured housing co-ops. So this is where the residents own their individual units, but they collectively own the land that they're on. And so they collectively decide what the lot rent should be. And what I found is that in these places, people are often paying less than $200 rent per month. And if you're paying less than $200 rent per month, it doesn't matter if you spend, not that it doesn't matter, but you have much more financial adaptive capacity in the face of a $300 or $200 energy bill. But certainly I could not find that convergence of high quality of life with low cost any more dramatically than what I could find in the co-op housing that we have in Tucson. But we have very little of it, right? We have about 700 mobile home parks in Tucson, and 3 of them are co-ops, right? We could have a lot more of it, a lot more of it. The other thing I would say is that this is essential housing, right? This is 10% of our housing units. We need to, as much as we are concerned about the substandard nature of some of it, to get rid of it would be devastating, right? This is the manufactured housing is often described as being the largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing. This is so-called naturally occurring affordable housing. And there are a lot of problems with it, but it is also providing roofs over heads for a lot of people that might otherwise not have better options. That's what I would say. And, you know, I think that there are ways in which we could, moving towards more co-ops, or even I like the idea of having community land trusts that perhaps provide the land that people could put their homes on, and that would be able to. Here's what I'll also say. Okay, this is a bigger point. One of the reasons why manufactured housing is relatively affordable is because it allows people to buy only what they need, the roof over their head, and not the other stuff, the land underneath, which is actually what is driving a lot of the costs. So one of the things that people will often criticize manufactured housing, they'll say it's a poor investment because it depreciates in value. Well, guess what? All housing depreciates in value. And oftentimes when you see home prices increasing, it's not because people are making investments in the structures of their home and making the structures better. The land is just getting more and more valuable. And so it's the fact that it's titled as real estate that's making it increase in value, not anything to do with the structure, right? So this is what a manufactured housing allows you to just buy the home independently of the land that it sits on, which is what makes it more affordable, but it's also what makes it more vulnerable, right? Because if you don't own the land that your home is on, that you know, you're kind of you're beholden to the person that that your home is sitting on, and that can allow people to charge very high rent because people can't move their homes; they can't just pick up and go somewhere else. Lots of hands up, so I should probably stop talking. And
yes, we're over time, but we're not done. So let's go to Nancy. What percentage, again, of manufactured homes are vulnerable right now? She cites the fact she's living in a manufactured home that is well insulated, good HVAC, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't have a breakdown of vulnerable versus not vulnerable, but the housing that we tend to be more concerned about is the older housing, and which is not universally problematic. I mean, if improvements have been made, then older manufactured homes can support a very good quality of life. But in Pima County, about 35% of the manufactured housing is pre-1976. So before that HUD code was put in place that had some minimal standards in terms of insulation, wiring, the types of materials that were used, the size of windows and things like that.
So a very rough way of estimating how much might be the most.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. And Danye.
I wanted to comment on what you were talking about before about social supports, because I think that's really hugely important. And I just wanted to share some thoughts I had about that. I think that we live in such an individualistic culture that people are kind of expected to just like take care of their stuff themselves, you know, and that's our mindset. So when a person is in need, what people generally expect people to reach out and ask for help if they need it. But what I'm understanding is that when you're in a place of great need, it becomes very difficult to do that. And that's the thing that people kind of don't understand in our culture. Like, we actually do need to we need support systems where we are reaching out to each other, and to where it's kind of just like becomes a normal thing for people to say what they need. Like I'm thinking a lot about resilience circles, for example, and I'm wanting to form one of those in my own life because I see that it is very difficult to reach out for help when you need it most because of our kind of societal assumptions that people are supposed to take care of their own stuff. We're not supposed to need things, like all of that stuff, believe it or not, really can have a great mental impact on whether or not someone actually reaches out for help when they most need it.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that's become very clear to me is that, some of the quote unquote nicer parks will have clubhouses, pools, little park spaces. But it's not those amenities that actually increase the quality of life. It's the fact that those amenities create opportunities for people to engage with each other, get to know each other, that I think creates the connections that are the source of resilience and quality of life. There is a tremendous amount in the interviews that we did. There's a tremendous amount in some of the better places to live that we did some of our work in. There's a tremendous amount of mutual aid that goes on. Tremendous amount. One of the key sources of contacts was a woman who has been described as the mayor of her park by various people that we spoke to. And she gave me a tour. We got on a golf cart and drove around. This woman knew absolutely every single person in this 400-unit park, it seemed. She knew who was really struggling. She knew who had made informal loans to people when they couldn't put food on the table, that kind of thing. There's a tremendous amount of stuff, and I think that this is another reason why I think manufactured housing is something that we need to think about. For whatever reason, it does seem to, when well organized, when well designed, to produce those types of relations that are often absent in other types of communities. So I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And don't forget to take your hand down when you're done, Trace, or when you've asked your question.
I'm concerned that you're saying that the pre-1976 mobile homes are a serious problem. I'm wondering how long you think they're going to last.
That's a good question. I mean, the reality is that any home can be made to last quite a long time, as long as there is investment made in it. Currently, there are retrofit programs that are available to people who are living in these older homes. Part of the issue, though, in speaking with the administrators that are responsible for these programs, is they often feel as though it's throwing good money after bad. That why spend $20,000 or $30,000 retrofitting a home that's worth only a few $1,000s? And the other reality is that it's very hard to get any sort of home improvement type loan for this type of housing. This is why I actually became interested in manufactured housing in the first place, is that many of the types of home lending products that are available to people that live in conventional mortgage real estate are not available to people living in mobile homes. And so that makes it very hard for people to purchase the home with an affordable loan. But it also makes it very hard for people to make improvements, which creates a cycle of vulnerability, right? There's a reason why these places become devalued and disinvested. It's because it's very hard for people to make investments in them. The units themselves, not the parks. That's a whole other story. But I agree, I share your concern. It's what are we going to do as these older units get more and more run down, but they're still providing housing to many of our most vulnerable residents, right? We need investment.
Thank you. Let's have, I think it's Jessica and then Kevin, then Nancy.
I was going to ask about the retrofitting. So I appreciate you talking about that, because I would kind of like to know more about like what some of those retrofitting options are for the homes. But I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the idea of creating more green spaces in these areas to reduce that sort of heat island effect that we know, there's probably a lot less green spaces in these areas by design, and which increase that heat island effect around those communities.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a great idea. So I'll share two things. So one thing that when we were working with Habitat for Humanity in the city of Tucson, one of our goals was to identify a park that might be willing to work with us on some sort of redevelopment. And one thing I've had a vision of is what would a mobile home park or manufactured home park designed for the Sonoran Desert look like, right? So that I think that there's lots of kind of urban design ways in which urban design could incorporate factory built housing that have not been explored. And I think we could do that. One of the things that I've had in my, beyond just more green space, one of the things I'd love to see more of is mobile home parks where the units are underneath solar carports. We see this all around Tucson, right? Parking lots where shade is provided by photovoltaics. There are a few RV parks in Tucson where you can see this, but it's not being more widely used. So, this would provide multiple benefits. One, it would reduce the amount of cooling that would have to happen because they would shade the structures, but it would also provide a renewable source of energy to the park. So there's lots of solutions. Actually, my colleagues up at ASU have created a compendium of solutions that I think is set to be published very soon, that I'd be happy to share with this group. And it includes everything from covering the outside of the unit with high R value cladding to solar carports, things like that. The other thing I would just say, in specific to green space, I interviewed an owner of several manufactured housing parks in Tucson, who is also the owner of a plumbing company. And he basically said to me that I think it's a great idea, except for in my parks, because trees are expensive. And oftentimes these are places that are run as businesses with thin margins. And so there's a lack of interest or willingness to do that. There are a few counterexamples. One of the best counterexamples, again, is a co-op. So there's a co-op that I know of near Swan and Grant that has an incredible tree canopy. And I know that they spend $30,000 a year just trimming trees, but they are also on their own well and get water for free. So these are a few of the conflicts here. Actually, in the panel that I met Stuart a part of, where I met Stuart, we were talking about this issue of trees, and people pointed out that there are health issues associated with trees and costs associated with trees that people don't really think about. Oftentimes there's funding to put the tree in the ground, but there isn't the funding to provide the water, or maybe it's not such a good idea to provide the water. They can create respiratory issues for people that have sensitivities to pollen, etc. Yeah, so I mean, more green space I think is good, but there are some challenges with it as a solution to heat islands and also extreme heat.
Great, thank you. Nancy.
Hi, I'm really excited about where this conversation has gone, thinking about the potential of using mobile homes to create communities. And I do think there's so much potential there. And I wanted to mention, I have some friends, well, I know a few people who have taken these old mobile homes and have made them absolutely artworks. They have found it's a lot of work, but it's possible, and to make them good structures again and make them livable, and people around, I live out in Picture Rocks and people do move them. So I think that is a potential, is taking these old ones and putting them together and creating communities, and that in the line of just recycling this material. So I would love to get a link or get some information about that study you were just saying is going to be released about these innovative ideas around making intentional communities. And I would think too about green space. If owners were given an option in these parks, I would think that they would be willing to work to help make some trees and make some green space. That's my.
No, I agree. I'm just saying oftentimes the park owners are not that enthusiastic about it. But there are some also amazing examples of parks with lakes and trees and things like that, even here in Tucson. Some really beautiful places with
they can be really, really beautiful homes for sure.
I mean, we don't really think about it, but we often talk about new urbanism as being a more sustainable way to develop cities. Manufactured home parks are new urbanism before new urbanism, right? I mean, this is, high density, single floor housing where things are not subordinated to the car, right? Where people get around almost entirely on foot, and actually in some of these older 55 plus places, the dominant mode of transportation is the golf cart, the electric golf cart. And they really are very unique spaces. I have not seen much research done on sort of the ecological footprints or the carbon footprints of these places, but I think there's no reason to think that they necessarily have to be high output, high energy consumption spaces. What I think makes them that way is the fact that they're located away from a lot of amenities. They've been treated for a very long time, and this is a bigger issue to talk about, by municipalities as locally unwanted land uses, and as a result have been pushed to sort of the urban margins or even into rural areas.
Wow. Now, Kevin, you put it in the chat, but would you like to ask the question directly?
Sure. Mark, as you know, the mayor and the city council here in Tucson have declared a climate emergency, and it's going to result in the development of a climate action and adaptation plan. So one of your arguments has been that it would be good to promote the co-op model for managing a mobile home park. So in connection with the preparation of that climate action plan, what are one or two things the city could do, a policy change or a program that would encourage mobile home parks to shift to the co-op model? Something that people could advocate for, obviously having to work with you and with the mobile home park community. But what could the city do to sort of move us in that direction?
There's lots that they can do. So first of all, I want to point out that in addition to declaring a climate emergency, Mayor Romero has also created an Equitable Housing Commission. And in its mandate, it explicitly mentions manufactured housing. So I've spoken with some people at the city who are interested in having me speak to that commission. I have not done that yet. But there are a number of things that they can do. So one, in terms of encouraging more co-ops, the biggest barrier to the conversion to co-ops is the fact that you have to get a bunch of low-income people to be able to buy the park, right? So that basically means that they're not going to be paying cash. They need loans. They need loans. And one of the paradoxes of our financial system is that the people that can borrow the most, that have to have the least cash, are the people that have the most of it. The richer you are, the more you can buy without using cash. So it's very difficult for a group of low-income residents to come together and get a loan that is appealing for an amount of money that is appealing for the owner. There are organizations that are devoted to this. One is called ROC USA, or Resident Owned Communities USA, and they're essentially lenders that are there to facilitate the conversion of privately held mobile home parks into cooperative residence. It's very hard for them to compete with other types of lenders. So as much as this is one of the paradoxes of manufactured housing, as difficult as it is to get a low-cost loan to buy a mobile home yourself as a resident, it is mobile home parks themselves, that collectively together are a very sexy asset class, where you may have seen some mainstream media coverage of how, you know, large real estate investment trusts, private equity firms, and other institutional investors have been buying a lot of mobile home parks. And so residents are essentially in a position where they're competing with those institutional investors, and that's a very hard thing to do. One of the ways that you can put them on a more level playing field is you can give the residents the right of first refusal. So when a park owner has decided to sell, you have to give the residents the opportunity to match that offer. So those are two things I think would be a big help. Finding some way to support access to financing for residents, but also making sure that they get a chance to make a bid by having the right of first refusal there. The other thing I would say, and believe it or not, this will drive you nuts, but housing works through finance in the United States. Basically, that's how different types of housing gets made. It's through subsidies at the financial level, and most of the subsidies are provided through the provision of, you know, insured mortgages, essentially, which lowers the cost, and through the creation of secondary markets for mortgages. So that's through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to support their duty to serve affordable housing options, have actually been providing subsidies to large institutional investors to purchase mobile home parks. Those subsidies are not available to ROC USA, for instance. So they're already favored by the very nature of how financial markets operate. And then the government steps in and gives them an additional advantage. So we have to level the playing field between residents and those investors that they're competing with. And this is important not only for creating co-ops, but also for preserving affordable housing. You'll see that there's growing attention and evidence that suggests that these institutional investors, once they own these properties, jack up rent considerably. So they are not only, you know, outcompeting residents from purchasing these parks, but they're a threat to their affordability as well. Oh, and there's some other things that we could do as well. The city could provide land. Like why, you know,
that's what I was just going to ask.
Like I know public housing is always, you know, is controversial, and, you know, you talk to sober-minded politicians, they'll say that's a pipe dream. But maybe manufactured housing is a place where we can sort of meet halfway. It's not that the city is building the housing, but they are providing the space. And the city owns lots of property. They could, you know, outfit it with pads so that the units could be serviced, and then the site rents could be provided at a subsidized rate. They could put in standards that say that the homes must meet certain energy standards, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of ways they could do that. So there's resident-owned communities, there's public mobile home parks, and there's potentially land trust models or nonprofit models as well out there.
Mark, you've given
And these
us-
are, I should also say that these are all models that exist, but in vanishingly small quantities. And I mean, and where they do exist, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they can provide a high quality, affordable housing. So and this is stuff that in many cases is already built. You know, it would just be a matter of changing the tenure structure or who the owner is. So this could be a way, this could be a way of providing additional affordable housing, but also to Teresa's question, a way of preserving existing affordable housing.
These are great thoughts, Mark. You've given us a picture of some pathways for hope and sustainability that for most of us might be completely new today to have heard these ideas. Everything from those last solutions, having a city providing land, supporting access to financing, give the residents the right of first refusal. And this is simply for the aspect of getting manufactured housing parks in ownership, cooperative ownership, and there's other things you've been talking about. So I think many of us would love to see that list of solutions that you and your colleagues are developing when it's available. And you know how to reach me. Thank you, everybody. We've hung in for an hour and a half. We thought it would be an hour. And I think no one's been watching the clock because it is so interesting. I would like, though, to check with the group. We usually take a 10-minute break. If we do, that's going to cut greatly into whatever else we had planned, which was Trace was going to talk about the issue of taking care of aging housing, not the manufactured housing, but the other houses. And I just found out last night that he invited Andres to come in and share a few thoughts. And I had an exercise for us to do relative to our ambassadorial skill development. Are you willing to just stay on the hot seat until noon today instead of taking a break? Would that be all right? I see some thumbs up. Okay, I'll assume that those who spoke are the ones who will be heard. Okay, great, thank you. So Mark, if you'd like to stick around, we love having you here. I know you've got a lot to do in your life. I think you've got a family, it sounds like. And
yeah, I'm going to stay. I didn't realize that there was another speaker or what the topic was. So I have to say, I really don't want to go. I'll stay around here for a bit, but I did not just say that I was going to be gone all morning to my wife. So I should probably say goodbye to you all. But thank you very much, Stuart, for inviting me. Thank you for being collectively such gracious hosts. And, you know, I hope we can connect in some way, shape, or form again in the future.
I hope so too. I'm glad the city's already planning to hear from you on some of your ideas. And, Kevin, by the way, has maybe leading the charge on our connecting more directly with the city about the climate energy plan or the climate emergency plan. So to be continued. Lots of thank yous in the chat box. And let's just shift our attention just a little bit on this Zoom screen to Trace, who is a founding member of Sustainable Tucson. Several years ago, about 2005 or 6, he was invited by the county to write a report on housing and what needs to be done for the housing stock we've got. And he wrote a lengthy report, did a lot of research. He's been looking recently for anything to follow up that work he did. And I did a little Google search for topics in general on sustainable housing and aging housing stock. And I think Trace is really excited to share some things on it. Trace, do I understand you'll have a few comments to make as well?
Yes, I'm hoping that we'll have a few minutes to actually discuss what some of the options are for dealing with our aging housing. I've asked Andres Portela to join me. Andres has a lot of experience with the city's actual housing programs. And Andres, we didn't really talk about this. Would you like to just take a couple of minutes and provide a quick overview governmental housing programs, particularly as they relate to repair and renovation as opposed to rent assistance or purchase. Would you like to do that or just hop in my presentation?
No, definitely. I can talk for just a few seconds. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm happy that Mark was right before me. Thank you so much. I actually was the one who wrote the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development, former senior policy advisor for the city of Tucson, focused on the intersection between racial equity and equity in the larger sense, and its connection to policy and land use. And so that is my core competency. That is my area of focus. And when Trace and I were having conversations around ultimately aging housing stock within the city of Tucson, we were trying to figure out the nexus between sustainability and home repair and the models that support funding a lot of the aging housing stock and rehabilitation. And let me just say, on the federal, state, and local levels, there are very few and far in between loan funds, there are grants, there are very few and far in between models to support that. But there have been some interesting case models around the nation that have shown us this kind of ability. But I want to talk about this affordability sense in the larger sense. We know that in 2020, over 1 million units became unaffordable. And that's through the LIHTC low-income housing tax credit model. That's how we support affordable housing, largely in the state of Arizona, but nationally it's a model as well. With that frame of thinking, we have to look at how are we funding the development of affordable housing, but how are we looking to make sure we rehabilitate it? Because I don't know, Trace, do you have that figure that says how much of Tucson or Pima County's aging housing stock is aged?
Well, we have approximately 130,000 homes in the metro area that are currently over 50.
Yeah, so if we think largely about Pima County and the city of Tucson, we know that our aging housing stock it's aging. And so addressing aging housing stock by rolling federal funds down to payment assistance, that's been the model. That's what they've done. They want to focus on getting people in home. But once we're in home, we have yet to see a sustainable model that supports the rehabilitation. And the city of Tucson has tried to come up with some major home repair programs. And I can drop in the chat a link to the city of Tucson, both major and minor home repair programs. And it focuses on major repairs, but it has to be under 25,000, minor home repairs, but it has to be under 10,000. And then there's some mobile home repairs, but again, it has to be under 7,500. And that's extremely important because right now we just don't know what we don't know. One of my biggest projects was that Commission on Equitable Housing and Development, and the approach that I took to creating that commission was, what is the differentiated forms of housing stock? We looked at mobile homes, we looked at traditional single family homes, we looked at a national movement for tiny homes, we looked at all of the different ways, condominiums, we looked at all of that. And we said, how do we create space and opportunity for differentiated lived experience to talk about it? So when we created that commission, we asked developers, we asked formerly homeless, we asked renters, we asked homeowners, we asked all of these folks to come into one space and talk purely on their lived experience. And that's how we're starting to tease out these really great ideas. But as we're teasing out these great ideas, we're seeing larger issues like workforce development. Do we have the workforce to provide the skilled labor to do all of these home repairs that are going to be needed because of our aging housing stock? And right now, I can honestly say we've seen it in Thrive in the 05. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar. Thrive in the 05, the massive reinvestment that the city of Tucson is attempting to do with the assistance of housing and urban development, we've seen that planning process ultimately check back in with our Office of Innovation, but our Economic Development Department to ultimately say, we don't have the workforce to sustain, even if we wanted to repair and we had billions of dollars to repair all of these homes that are aging, do we have the workforce to sustain that? And we just don't at the moment. And so really it's understanding all of these very complex issues like workforce development, our housing market, which the city has done a really great job of doing the housing market study over the last years. But again, they didn't even talk about they very minutely talked about our aging housing stock. Trace, am I hitting on exactly what you wanted or no? Because I can tell you about how we fund it. Generally, we fund rehabilitation through community block development grants and home funding. Community block development grants are an acknowledgement that both local, state, and federal are trying to get out of the business of housing rehabilitation, but also ownership of property. This model is ultimately the city and the state give the funds to a nonprofit to manage those funds. And so a lot of those funds don't get directly to the consumer. They are also, most of them end up in administration. So we're getting less funds going to the consumer itself or the folks who really need to do that massive rehabilitation. There has been what I feel a good example of funding that comes from a city, and that's going to take place in Austin with the Miller Project, where they spent $100 million on land acquisition. They spent about $28 million on focusing specifically on low-income communities having access to housing markets. But then there was $28 million for home repair and conditions. But if we look at the failure of that, it required a bonding. So the city said that they were going to go out and do a bond. The county in general said they were going to go out and do a bond, and they ended up bringing in $6 to $11 million to fix the affordability issue in Austin, and it ultimately created a larger issue where the funds weren't replenishing itself. So again, we haven't figured out this larger issue of funding long-term for affordability and rehabilitation, and making sure those folks who are able to now buy homes are able to rehabilitate and keep them long-term.
Well, that's a great set of issues for us to begin to think about. Are there any other things you really want to bring up at this point?
I think at this time, not really. I think we need to focus on a rehabilitation loan fund that could really just focus on, the self-replenishing, because really what we have now, we have a federal model that provides us with money, but they're not replenishing over time. So we're only capturing a singular net. The federal government is then having to check back in with Congress to get more funds for that. So a self-replenishing loan fund specifically for rehabilitation. That's all I can advocate for.
Great. Well, thank you, Andres. What I'm going to do is talk about the research that I've done about what is the status of our old homes and what we might be able to do. Can everybody see my screen here? Is that a yes?
Lots of heads are nodding. We're good.
Okay. That's great. What I have up here are a few excerpts from a 2008 Arizona Town Hall program on housing. They say we have a whole lot of old housing because we had a boom after World War II. They need a lot of repairs, and there's debate about whether or not we should just tear them down and replace them or try to fix them. they reference something that says at the time there were 50 to 80,000 old homes over 50, and 50 being an important time because that's about the point when a lot of homes begin to experience major repair costs. And they reference a 2004 study on housing. It turns out that's probably this study called Empowering Local Communities. So I'll talk about what it is we actually know, because apparently this is the only thing we actually know. Let's see, how do I advance? Okay, this is the Empowering Local Communities research project I did for the county. What you see on the screen there is a map of all the single family homes in Metropolitan Tucson and the 3 zones that made up the survey area that I researched. I was able to identify 600 homes that, as you can see on the far upper right, that's the comparison between the makeup of those zones as identified by the assessor's office, and the red bars are what the survey actually surveyed. And the same for the age of the people and the age of the income, or the range of the incomes. The blue is the city of Tucson and the yellow is the survey. So it was good in terms of the age of occupants, and it's okay in terms of the income. But that was the result of sending out 600 surveys and getting 23% of them back, or 138 homes. The colors that you see there are the decade that the house was built in. So the gray is either pre-war or the brief period after World War II. Brown is 50s, yellow 60s, green is 70s. And you can see the 3 zones that I have included some of all of those. The blue and the red were beyond the scope of the study. What we're facing now is a really major problem. There are 130,000 50 plus. I don't know how to stop that thing. 130,000 homes over 50 already. And that number is going to go up to about 400,000 in the near future. So we're experiencing, we're at the beginnings of a great increase in the need to repair things, even if we don't do it. So what are the conditions of these old homes? Well, based on my survey, half of them have some kind of a problem, but not necessarily all that severe. But about 1 in 7 houses reported a serious problem with either roof, furnace, or water or sewer plumbing. Beyond that, it's estimated that 15 to 25% of the homes will eventually have elderly people living in them, and most of them are not going to work very well if for someone with a mobility problem. A Swedish study that Stuart found estimated that more than 80% of the homes had accessibility problems. And a US study from fairly recently concluded that only 4% of the homes don't have accessibility problems. The chart on the right shows the number of homes that would be projected to have one or more than one problem as a function of age. That dip in the purple line may just be a statistical phenomena. There were only 29 houses that made up that cohort, and a change of just 3 would have added another 8 or 10 percentage points to it. So that may be just a statistical problem. So the condition of our homes is, well, great opportunity for improvement. I always love that phrase. We've got a, our old homes are very energy inefficient, but they could be dramatically improved with a strong effort to make them more efficient. So the text says the old home has 60% higher, or alternatively, you could cut your utility bills by 40% by doing a lot of things that aren't necessarily cheap, but would be financially worth it if you could get the right financing and other issues. I was able to get the utility bills for 32 houses. And as you can see, the monthly energy bills per square foot, or monthly energy bills, there was a 7-fold difference between what are essentially the same houses, but because of specific problems with that house or the way people live, there can be a huge difference in how much money you have to pay. We had one instance when I had a program to try to train people to fix old houses. Somebody had left out a piece of drywall in the top of a closet. And so there was a direct short circuit to the attic. So we tried to pressurize the house and couldn't, because there was about a 4 square foot hole in the wall. These old houses make up a major portion of everything. There's 128,000 50-year-old and older homes inside the city limit, 190,000 currently inside the county. And those numbers actually don't change in terms of their absolute numbers, because we're not making any more 1950s homes. What we have is just getting older, but they're everywhere. So there's a political interest in dealing with them. One of the problems we're facing is that Tucsonans are actually kind of poor. The real income of Tucsonans has dropped over the years. In 2005, adjusted for inflation, families probably had many thousands of dollars less income compared to the last time they had to replace a furnace or roof. I neglected to say something important. Actually, I'll wait till I get a better slide. It's critical to understand that a house probably experiences a problem because of the age of the house. Most houses, whether they're sold for a lot or a little, were actually made in the same way by the same people. They just have more sizzle for that higher price, but the pipes and the wires and the ducting and things like that are really about the same. So a house that was built in one period will have the same problems as all the other houses around them built at the same time. So in 2005, a 1970s house was probably at the end of its second roof and first furnace, but it was different for the plumbing because the plumbing has a different lifetime. So you see the yellow line there is roofing problems. It made sense that in 2005, a 1950s house doesn't have a big roof problem. It's in the middle of its, I think, second home, second roof, or near the beginning of its third, whereas a house built in the 70s is at the end of its first life. So all the houses in an area will have about the same set of problems at the same time, which could potentially is a great opportunity for dealing with the problems. But it's important to understand that middle class doesn't mean you have enough money to deal with things. The purple line there is the number of single problems that people had and they, to my mind, they seem to be similar whether you're low income, medium income, or upper income. Having one problem was a function of the age of the house, but whether you could fix it before the next problem occurred was a function of how much money you had. So being middle income didn't have a whole lot of impact on whether you had a second problem, but you had to get into the upper third of income in order to be able to fix the problem when it occurred and not have to wait years to save those thousands of dollars. So middle class in Tucson is not a good position to be in. As Andres said, we're losing our workers, and I've been hearing people recently complaining about the lack of workforce as if that was somehow unexpected. We stopped training people in high school voc ed programs during Ronald Reagan. And the average age of people in the remodeling field today is over 50. If you look at the graph on the right, and there are two scales, so it's a little difficult to read, but the percentage of people who are almost ready for retirement is an increasing percentage of the total remaining workforce, whereas been substantial decrease in your prime age workers, and very few new people are coming into the field. So we've known for decades that right about now was when we would experience real serious labor shortages, and it's entirely expected. I interviewed the dean of Pima College's technical education, and he told me that we're keeping up with things now, but it's going to get much worse real fast. And the owner of a remodeling contractor says, and even if you do teach people, you're only teaching new construction, and that isn't what we need to fix existing homes. So just as we are about to need a whole lot of new people, we're losing the ones we have. So what do we know? Most houses are concentrated. 2/3 of all these old houses are inside the city limits, and 2/3 of those are, 2/3 of our old houses are actually inside the city limits. And it turns out that 2/3 of the houses in Tucson, in the city, are actually over 50. So you start thinking, what would happen if we don't repair 2/3 of all the houses inside the city limits? That's a problem for everyone. And as I said, most of these problems will have approximately the same problems at the same time. We also know that being middle class, middle income, doesn't give you enough money to fix things when they happen, and they tend to pile up. And the reality is we're losing the workforce to do the work that needs to be done, but it's not a local problem. There are 53 million such homes in this country alone, and the rest of the world was also rebuilt after World War II. So it's probably a global problem. It's not our fault. The reality is that there are a lot of things beyond just personal decisions that created this problem. Our public infrastructure is heavily oriented towards expansion to accommodate new capital, but the roads and the water pipes and the sewer pipes and the water supply and all of that, we're spending money, most of our money, on subsidizing the cost of new growth. The banks, as I believe Mark was saying, you can't get a loan if you're poor. Those are the people who need loans most, but we don't do that. There's an interesting technical problem. Companies that make HVAC systems make one size for the whole country, and as a result, they don't fit Tucson. You pretty much have to get something that's improperly sized for our conditions, so that raises the actual cost. A really important external factor is utility regulations. Utilities make their profit on the amount of capital they own. If they were to, and they make their revenue on the basis of the product they sell. What that means is if they were to invest in helping me improve the energy efficiency of my own home, they'd lose big time. They wouldn't get a profit because they don't own it, and they would get less revenue for it. So we're in a very bad situation where we've forced our utilities to be actual enemies of conservation. Most problems occur in the same neighborhood at the same time, and it's the same people who they were built at the same time by the same people using the same materials and design techniques. And as a result, all those old homes are basically the same. And you get to choose one from column A and one from column B. And finally, another institutional barrier is that if a person is a renter, it's generally in the landlord's worst interest to spend money on improving their energy efficiency because the tenant pays the bills. So if I, as the owner of the property, make thousands of dollars investments in improving the energy efficiency of the house, they get the benefit and I get the expense. And as a property manager for 40 years, I will tell you that in all that time, I've only had 3 or 4 tenants ever ask what the utility bills are. So people just aren't thinking about it. Andres covered this in 2005. The federal government provided the city and county with about $3 million for home repairs. They were able to do something on 1,400 houses, but really most of it, half of it was for minor home repairs and at average cost of under $300. So there's a little bit of federal money, but it doesn't go very far. And the key thing to understand is there are 53 million such homes, at least older homes, in the US. And the idea the federal government is going to come up with a huge amount of additional funds just doesn't make sense. I estimate that the cost of repairing all those old homes in total, including whatever people have already done, is probably in the range of $4 trillion. So it's not something the federal government is going to be able to do a whole lot about. The money is going to have to come from us. So some of the things we don't know: how old is the house? Even though it was built in a specific area, the assessor doesn't keep track of it. They have a construction year, but it's actually the modified construction year. So if you've made any legal changes to the house, they modify that age. You could guess at it, but we actually don't know. we also don't know the condition of anything. We also don't know what each individual house is made of. The particular technologies change over time, and that's a good thing, but it means you've got to employ different approaches depending on the problem. Most houses don't seem to be able to accommodate people with physical handicaps. We don't know whether they had lead-based paint or asbestos. Let's see, what else?
Trace, I'm watching the clock,
Okay.
and you have given us an amazing granular look at some of the issues that Tucson is facing. Maybe doesn't know it's facing it, but it's facing.
Well, okay, let me briefly say there's what I identified was a great deal of deferred maintenance. It seems if Tucson were spending at the rate the nation currently is, we should be spending over $1 billion a year on housing rehab. And in 2005, I estimated it was a fifth of that. So what's it gonna take? Money, workers, regulations, and a whole new business model. I hate to not go through the funding, but basically we're probably spending enough money to fix the stuff, but we're not spending it to fix the stuff. So an example of another funding source would be that if you've got a medical insurance policy, if the insurer were willing to pay for handicap modifications, they might be able to save tens of thousands of dollars a year to avoid putting you in a nursing home. So there are actually a number of different ways to reduce costs or provide additional funding. So I've got a series of recommendations about actions. And the first one is confirm the problem. We need to redo this study. It's fine as far as it goes, but there's a lot more information we need. The second thing is really, let's see, is really quite important. That's in 1999, the city participated in the Green Retrofit Program with the Midtown neighborhood. They were able to provide matching funds and education and things like that. So they were able to encourage people to spend about $3 on their own homes for every dollar of matching funds. So there's a way to test out what it is that would actually make things better. There's a whole issue of the entire local economy. Do we want to focus on tourism and mining and things like that? Or this term industry cluster is a jargon that says, let's collect all of the different groups that are involved in this industry and help them work together. We could have a redevelopment industry cluster that helps people, Tucson be absolutely world-class in fixing our old homes. And finally, there's a repair resource center patterned after a group called the Cleveland Heights Home Repair Resource Center. They have been able to teach people how to fix things, provide assistance for seniors, and because of the financial education program and an investment in local banks, they've been able to buy down the loan rate and get deferred loan terms for low-income houses or homeowners. So it's a tool that's available to actually begin to tackle some of these financing issues. So I did want to point out all the people who don't have information. I asked the city and county housing directors if they have any information on these old homes. They said no. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies said no. The HUD's Housing Research Organization doesn't appear to have. I'm not sure if Mark is still here, but when I talked to him recently, he said he didn't have any additional information on the actual condition of our old houses. And this town hall report only has this information. They didn't have any additional. So that's a nutshell of the research that I did.